Good morning, friends, and welcome to Morning Coffee with Kyle, a show on our YouTube channel that, together with its companion series, Afternoon Tea with Jess, offers you an opportunity to listen in to overhear conversations about life and ministry that we have with our friends and colleagues. And I am very excited about the friend that I have for us this morning. He's someone I have literally known my entire life. Practically a brother of mine, and I look forward to letting you hear what we might talk about today. Let's go ahead and bring him in now. So today I am welcoming my friend Evan Smith, the Reverend Dr. Evan Smith, a lifelong friend of mine. And Evan, tell us more about where you are and who you are, and in a minute we'll talk about what you've been thinking about.
Sure. So I am Evan Smith. I've known Kyle since kindergarten, really. So long time. And I'm serving Second Presbyterian Church, though we just call ourselves Second Church, in the Shenandoah Valley, Stanton, Virginia. Beautiful part of the state. And in my time here, basically came as a change agent looking to revitalize the church. When I began, we had about 45 to 50 in active attendance, and it was a pretty big shift from where I'd been in my former call. Folks that our average attendance there have been more along the 100 range, and so like going to half, but also markedly different in age as these folks were much older, and really were looking to make some changes to see where God was wanting to take them, as they were eager just for leadership and to be able to go and follow wherever the Holy Spirit would lead. And so I really felt a strong call to come here. And so we've been doing this cool thing and looking at what God's doing in his church. And it's been exciting. And thank you for having me on Morning Coffee with Kyle.
Morning Coffee with Kyle. I'm glad that you are joining me this morning. So last week I had Joel Long on, and maybe I should tell everyone that Joel was both of our pastors growing up in some different respects. But Joel and I were talking really at the end of our conversation about the ways that our congregations can seize upon this moment where we have sort of taken a break from all of our regular activities and think very intentionally about the church we want to be when we come back. And that's a little bit of what I think you and I are imagining we might talk about today. And so I'm just going to let you launch into that.
Sure. So as Kyle and I were talking about things, Kyle was intrigued by my doctoral project. The doctoral project I was doing is basically about sanctification. That is the process of becoming holy. That's what that fancy word means. And I know we hear that, and some folks are like, I don't want to be holy. That we hear this term holy, we think holier than thou. But I mean, that's the point of the spiritual life, though, is to become holy. Being holy is to become more like Jesus. And so that's what we're striving to do. And so as we're doing that work, there was a lot of things that had led me to that project. And in particular, I studied the work of the Enneagram, which is this ancient personality assessment thought to be, I mean, we know it goes back at least to the Desert Fathers in the 4th century, but there's some hints that it may be even older than that. But as we were considering that work and doing that work, there's a lot of things that I sort of intuited and studied a bit for like congregational revitalization. But when you're trying to write something up into like this 200-page thesis, you don't get to be like, I feel like this is the way, or I've sort of seen. So all my research, there was this one work that I wholeheartedly recommend to any pastor or deep spiritual thinker, just for someone who wants to understand kind of like what's forming us and shaping us. It's this work by James K.A. Smith called You Are What You Love. And through reading that, I realized there's a lot of things that have been forming the ministry that God's done through me and the ways I've been doing ministry at Second Church, but I couldn't have said it the way he does. And so in thinking about like congregational revitalization, thinking about like trying to just stir up spirits and hearts and longings, as I've thought about it, just for the sake of this conversation and building on the doctoral project I did, I sort of see things in all of that is like this three-phase thing. And first, it's this idea of we need to have this paradigm shift from our minds to our hearts. And I'll speak about that just a little bit. I mean, we can go into depth more as you like, Kyle. And then let that then lead into a greater culture change in the church, and centering a lot of the times the church right now, we think about it in terms of what of us, like what I get. You hear about like my walk with God, like, the church meeting my spiritual needs, and how we change that from being such a me-centered faith to instead, I would say, a Jesus-centered, which makes us an others-centered faith. And the way we do that then becomes, and part of the bigger project, I think, for us is this idea of how we then live out our faith based on simple, small habits that have a big impact overall. And so I've said a lot of times, I think a lot of churches think that the answer to how to help people grow spiritually is just to keep them busy with churchy things. And I think a lot of times we in the church, we've done a good job keeping the saints busy, but we haven't done a great job helping them to become holy. And so busyness and holiness don't always go hand in hand, and how it is that we can develop small, sustainable habits, and as a church, how we can help people to do that, to then grow in their walks with God. So those are the things I've been largely thinking about, and I'm happy to speak in more detail on any of those, Kyle.
So I'm thinking about your last point, and keeping the saints busy, but not necessarily helping them to be holy. And it strikes me as having a really interesting parallel to our culture at large. I know I talk about a lot this busyness culture that we live in, where it seems like for many of us, certainly those of us who are kind of in that younger driven phase of our lives, that it's always busy all the time. We're always on the go, whether it be our occupation, or taking our kids to this kind of practice or this kind of ball game, or meeting all of our church commitments, of which there could be as many as 3 or 4 a week. And we have a lot of folks really busy and active at Alamance, but one of the things the staff and I talk about all the time, is really this: are we helping folks to grow in their spiritual life, and are we helping them embody the love and work of Jesus Christ in these things we do? The Easter egg hunt is fabulous. Our Wednesday night meals are a wonderful time of fellowship. Our service going to urban ministry and putting together a meal for those folks. All of those things are extraordinarily good in the life of our congregation, but do they ever lead us to think about something more? Sort of Jesus's point when he fed 5,000 people in John's gospel, and everyone was amazed and astounded. But what did he do after that? He wanted to have a real deep conversation about how our souls are fed. He says, I didn't do that, and I'm paraphrasing, but I didn't feed those 5,000 people just to do something extraordinary. I did it so they could be fed on the word. And that's part of what we're talking about, I think, right now. But tell me more about the moving from the head to the heart idea that brought up.
Well, we're still products of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, this philosophical age, 1700s, all that, people think so much of it. But what the Enlightenment effectively did was it said that we are thinking creatures more than we are feeling creatures. And it said that, like, the mind is the most important thing. I mean, think of Descartes: I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. That was the whole big sweeping philosophy of that. And we still work in that way. And by the way, I'm not demeaning the intellectualization of things, even if I'm having trouble saying the word right now. I'm not demeaning the mind at all. I think we just need to understand how God made us instead of trying to work from how we wish God had made us. And I guess here's what I mean by that. St. Augustine had this great thing he talks about. He says, God stirs us so that praising God is what brings us joy. Because God has made us and drawn us to himself. And therefore, and here's the big quote. So therefore, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in God. And it's all about this heart's longing. But after the Enlightenment, the church has acted instead like what the reality is that like God has made us to know him and understand him, and our minds are ignorant until they understand God. And there's a difference. And we can talk about the heart's understanding, but think about like how we treat discipleship. We make it all about studying the Bible, memorizing things, and just all this knowledge acquisition, in the hopes that knowledge acquisition will then change our habits and our hearts. But it doesn't really seem to work that way. I mean, if it did, then like people just simply knowing the Bible alone would be enough to make you a better Christian. But there are plenty of people who know the Bible and have weaponized it and use it, you know, in all these terrible ways. And it's like, wow, you really know scripture, but it doesn't seem to have made you any holier at all. And then on the converse side, you can have folks who may not know anything about theology or the Bible and yet love God and love others to such a degree you're like, that person knows Jesus in a way I don't. And I don't mean know in the head sense there. I mean it in the heart sense. And so I think it's worth going back and remembering, like Jesus, when he called people, you know, he often said, like, basically, like, will you come and follow me? Like, it's this idea of longing. In the Gospel of John, like when disciples come to him early on, he straight just says, what do you want? And I think that is still the question Jesus would ask us, but we have let our wants be shaped more by the world than by the things that God wants. And so, like, if we think about the things we long for, how often are we longing after the things that God longs after versus how much have we been conditioned to long after that brand new truck or that new TV or whatever thing of the world, the advertising thing has taught us we have to have this. And so when I talk about the paradigm shift, it's about realizing that discipleship is not about changing how we think. It's about changing our hearts to change our habits. I think like it's the re-habituation of what you love, because you are what you want and you want what you love. And so that's kind of this idea there.
A mentor of mine, Stan Ott, talks about this in the different senses of knowing. He talks about the Greek sense of knowing, which is very much, centered on the head, on philosophy and learning and method and science, versus the Hebrew way of knowing. In Hebrew, when you know something, it's because you have lived it out. You've experienced it. You've made it a part of your life. You've enfleshed it, which is an idea, I think, pretty radical and foreign to the thinking of the Greek mind, but fundamental to the Christian experience, right? Whether that be the Spirit dwelling in us or, God coming and being Emmanuel among us. The other thing you were making me think about is that Buechner quote that everybody loves, that my church loves in particular, that our calling, our vocation, what we are about is that place where our heart's longing and the world's greatest need, come together and meet. And that thing is that thing that really can drive us in our walk with God. And so I think that when we hear that quote, it really strikes a chord with us, because it says it's really what we want to do. It's about finding our passion. And that's a great way to understand it. But I love your words about longing, right?
And I think that if I could jump in here, sorry to...
You're good.
But I definitely I just was like, man, this ties in so perfectly, and I don't want to have the moment pass us by. Because I think that's the big thing. That Buechner quote's wonderful. And I think part of the idea of the paradigm shift and the culture change is about helping people to realize that so much of what they think they want is actually the shaping of the world on their hearts instead of the shaping of God. Because so often, you think about the times that I long for things that I know are not the longings of God. I think about this longing that I've had to win the lottery at points. That's not Jesus within me. I can try to spiritualize that all I want and be like, but I would give so much away. I would do so much good. But that's a worldliness that's shaped by, all these other things within the world. It's not shaped by God. And so like the way I think as we're trying to do ministry and to help people's hearts reconnect with God so that our hearts long for the things that God's hearts long for. I think a lot of times in the church, what we've done is we've laid out like this program, this method of discipleship, this whatever else it is. And we tell people, and usually in the Protestant circles, it's like more prayer, more Bible study. And those are great things for sure. But I think part of the culture change is about instead teaching people how to connect with the heart of God to then long for the things God longs for. There's this great quote by this French writer, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I'm guessing he's French. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. He's the author who wrote The Little Prince. And basically what he talks about, he says, if you want people to build a ship, don't drum them up to collect wood and then give them tasks to actually build the ship. Instead, teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that. It's like, so and I think that's the thing. We're trying to get people to build a ship so they can go out to sea. But we're spending so much time telling them, don't you want a ship? Isn't a ship great? And they're like, I don't see the point of a ship. Why are we building a ship? When what we need to do is like, no. The point of the ship is so we can go to the sea. Guys, think about the sea. And that's what I think within the church is this paradigm shift as well. And I talk about culture change. It's this thing of like, what is the point of the spiritual life? What is this longing? What is this thing that God is doing in our hearts where those, the world's greatest need and our hearts meet? Like that's the vision. That's the place to come to teach people to dream for the things that God is dreaming about doing with them. Yeah. That's one of the things that has been so neat in my current context. And we'll see how things pan out after COVID-19 ends. But, we had this whole thing, like there's I talked to our elders about like to dream in this way and to start thinking in this way. And one of them began this brand new ministry that, I'll be honest, when he first brought it to me, I thought it was going to be the silliest thing, and I wanted nothing to do with it. And it's been the most wildly successful thing. And it's dog church. And so he came to me and he pitched this idea. I'm like, dog church. And he's like, yeah, a church where people like bring their dogs and you have church together with dogs. And I'm like, and I remember my head being like, well, swing and a miss there, old Jer, but good hustle out there, like this is, but I mean, it's just kind of like, you know what, man, this is your project, this is your thing. He really felt like God laid it on his heart, and it's become this amazing thing that meets once a month. And of the 15 regulars we have who come in with their dogs on Sunday afternoon, only 2 have any other form of church that they go to. And so for 13 of the dog church is their church. And it's like, this is amazing. And we have another elder who really wanted to start small groups. And I'll be honest, I had tried and failed. Like there was no traction. No one had it. And I'm like, you know what? Wrong time. And then this one guy comes in and just boom. And now we have small groups because this one elder just had this desire of his heart. We have another elder who is trained as my mind. I hate this. The folks who are trained for pastoral care. Help me out here, Kyle.
Like Stephen Ministry?
Thank you. Samaritan Ministry is all that was coming to my head, and I knew that wasn't right. Yes,
no,
we have someone who came in who was a Stephen's minister, and we were working and putting things in place to make our church like a Stephen's Ministry church. Mm-hmm. And it's just like all these things were born out of like following where God is leading people's hearts, but this wasn't work that happened immediately. It wasn't like, I mean, there was this paradigm shift and this culture change to learn to allow our hearts to love the things God loves.
And one of the things that brings to mind, and I think it's just worth pointing out in this conversation, is how wonderful it is when people come to us with those kinds of things. I mean, I think a lot of that, the model is wait to see what the pastor or the staff comes up with. And those things are often really wonderful. But your examples, I mean, all of them absolutely catch ride on the idea that someone has a passion and they bring it to the church and the church sees it to fruit, right? Like
Mhm.
that is about longing. And we might come up with the idea and it's not about longing, it's about it being a program, right? We want to have this as a church. Whereas that elder or that leader in your congregation is feeling that on their heart. And it's not lost on me that that's the time it catches, not when we've tried it because we think it's a good idea, but when someone actually has it in their heart. And that model, I think, is really good because it's empowering for the people of the church to do the work of ministry rather than just expecting the paid professionals to do it, so to speak. And that's a really important thing that I think needs to happen in the change that the church experiences.
And I think that's where we're going to have to go in the midst of our COVID-19 world, by the way.
Yeah.
Like, just as we're thinking about what the church is and people are grappling with that and trying to figure out there is no normal anymore. There is no going back to that. Because even if the virus mysteriously just completely disappeared, a lot of things people like which change. People, I was talking with an introverted friend of mine recently who was like, man, like I always thought I loved the church despite all these things. And now I'm like, I feel like I'm getting all the things I loved about church and I can just stay home. And so I'm like, are we going to lose all our introverts because they're discovering, like there are ways to connect spiritually with people and not have to actually go out and do it. And things of that sort. But for about 3 years, I would say I've been working on like the culture change part. In the last 2 years, while that culture change is still a continual thing, the last 2 years, what it's really been about has been, okay, God's put this on your heart. How do we then serve God from this place? How do we then do it? Because God's called every single one of us to a ministry. Like we're all called to ministry. And I kind of think that what's happening with the church is the church can't become or be the depot where spiritual things happen. And that's the sum totality of your spirituality. I mean, you may say a few prayers or whatever, but really it's all centered in that Sunday worship experience. And instead, I think it's going to have to become this thing that we have spiritual habits that we do every day to bolster us so that we can be spent and used by God in the kingdom. And yes, so then church on Sunday becomes a place of training, of equipping, of worship. Absolutely. Those are all things that are there too. But it can't just be like a thing we check off and to be like, okay, that's done. Because I think a lot of times for us, it's almost like, oh, I want to be a good person. I want God to, be pleased with me. So here's my checklist of things I need to do. And we have church attendance high on the list. And that's not going to fly in the future. It really has to be about the ways we are equipped and empowered. Like one perhaps illustration of this that I think it's a good one. But you and I both we've been on these weight loss journeys, man. We started about the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Sometime I know mine was August 19th. Do you have an exact date when you began eating healthier? What's that?
September 5.
So yeah, right around the same times. I think that sometimes the way we do church now, and because when we think of our spirits and the way some folks, the way they prioritize their church attendance, what they look to the church to be, it would be as if like you ate really healthy at Sunday lunchtime. Like it was the perfect meal, stuck to the perfect diet, right amount of like protein and carbs and fat and everything else. But then you're gaining weight every week. And you're like, why am I gaining weight? On Sunday at lunch, have you seen the meal? But then every other meal, you're just going nuts with pizza and hoagies and candy or ice cream or whatever else. But you do that one meal just right. And you're like, why am I gaining weight? Like, I think it's that way for us spiritually when we put everything around the Sunday worship experience to be the sum totality of our spirituality. Now, like, does that make sense?
It makes sense. And I want to add two things to it, really. Two things. And one is about community. I think that when we make the Sunday hour or that time we come to church, maybe even those couple of times we come to church a week, the sum total of our spiritual focus, then it becomes very individualistic and about us and our relationship to God. in the model that you're describing and lifting up, I think that something that jumps out to me is if we're making our spiritual life a part of our daily habit, and our regular routine a part of the rhythm of life, then one of the things that allows us to do is understand that Sunday morning time to be what the church is really for, the people coming together to assemble, right?
Yeah.
And that goes back to that one person, that introvert or that group of introverts who, oh, I'm getting a lot out of this, now I don't have to come. Wait a minute, no, church is actually about the time that you come.
Right.
And if you're an introvert and relate to God that way, you should be doing that introverted work, in your spiritual growth every other day. And then you, maybe if you can't stand it, I'm sorry, but you tolerate it because, Christianity is something that's meant to be lived out in community. And some of us, like me, are community starved during COVID-19, right? Like every time I get around my people and I'm supposed to be distanced and, I'm supposed to be in my car rather than out and about, I struggle with that mightily because, I'm hyper extroverted and seem to be growing more so rather than less, which is odd for a pastor. That hour on Sunday is about being together in corporate worship, right? It's about the two or three or more are gathered. And oftentimes in our culture, we've made it about me coming and getting the spiritual fix that I need, because that's really the only opportunity we're availing ourselves of. And that's not what the hour is about. It's not what worship is about. Worship is supposed to be us coming together to be the chorus of those doing the work of the people. And the audience is our God, not we come together and sit and our audience is of whatever's happening on stage or at the pulpit. And maybe God will do something good through that. That's not the model. The former is the model. And being in community, I think we allow that the fullness of its expression if we are cultivating those other habits at other times during the week. But let's talk more about those little habits that you have you've lifted up. And I love your analogy about about what we eat. If we're filling our bodies but forget bodies, if we're filling our spirits with junk all week long, and then we go that one time and think, oh, I ate healthy this time, that's going to lead me to that healthy spot. It's never going to work. But what are some of those habits that you're talking about? I know you worked on this in your doctoral project, but what are some of those little things that people can be doing beyond just, oh, I said my prayer before I ate, or I said my prayer at bedtime, or maybe I had 10 minutes of Bible study a day?
I think this ties into when I talked about the culture change thing. The big emphasis of the culture change that I want to set up just first before going into the habits thing is the idea that, and it ties into what you were saying, that Sunday worship isn't about me. Like we have to turn the shift from this me-centered thing and my spiritual needs to instead a Jesus heart-connected thing. Because when we're connected to the heart of Jesus, it makes us about others. But that's hard to do because our sinful nature is always turning our slant inward. Augustine argues that sin is essentially just selfishness. Like it's anything we do in our self-interest, he says, is a sin. And so that's the difficulty, is thinking about how many folks have been like, well, you know what? I didn't like that sermon, so therefore church did nothing for me. And it's like, but the person beside you or 10 other people beside you might have thought this was amazing. But if you don't like that sermon, you may use it as a reason I shouldn't come back to this church anymore. I didn't like what the pastor said that time. And it's neglecting all the other things about worship and community and fellowship, while exalting too much the individual, whether it's the individual who's the pastor or the individual's preferences or whatever else. And so there's all these things. The reason I mentioned that first is the thing that helps us grow most sometimes is the thing that at first we rebel against most. Like, okay, you hear all these people talk about like runner's high, which I've never gotten. I've tried running and I've just never gotten to that point where I just had this euphoric feeling like, oh man, running feels great. But at first it's this awful, awful thing, but you have to push through it. So that's the idea of the runner's high, is that you have to do this work to condition yourself, and then suddenly you can learn to enjoy it. Or maybe oh, Kyle, I mean, like you are a musician, and so you know what it is to like have worked hard to be good at your instrument, but at first may not get pleasure from it. You know,
No.
like you may be like, oh, as I'm working, like trying to play this trumpet and get everything going, and like you can't quite get it, but suddenly when you've put in the work, you know your scales, you can make music, and that's where joy is.
Right.
But if you had given in earlier on, you know, like in the spiritual analogy here, it's basically making everything about yourself, then you never would have gotten to the point of experiencing that joy. And
The
so
good instrument, I'm
Go ahead.
sorry. The good instrument for that is the guitar, right? And you have to get calluses on the tips of your fingers in order to play the thing. Otherwise, your fingers are too soft and you can't hold the strings down, and it sounds terrible. You can't make good music out of a guitar unless the tips of your fingers are hard. And the only way to make them that way is to practice. It sometimes literally bleed. I don't think I ever bled and learned to play the guitar, but it hurts, right? It hurts at first, but then your fingers toughen up and it doesn't hurt anymore. It's the same analogy, but I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, I appreciate that because that helps. Because I was trying to connect it back to you because I remember trumpet, but I forgot you taught yourself guitar. You have talents I wish I had, but that's another story. So,
Well, yeah, but I just took the time to do them. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah. So with the work I did with the project was about that ancient discipline, the Enneagram. And basically with the Enneagram, there are 9 different types, each with a wing that's one number higher or lower, which kind of makes it like 18 different types of people and how we express certain things. And each of those types, we have one corresponding great strength and one corresponding great weakness, especially like the deadly sins is what the Desert Fathers related it back to. And so there are some things that come easily to us that we can call, like if you're thinking about rowing in a boat, there's the downstream practice, the thing that's just, phew, and man, I'm loving this. This is great. I'm just going. And then there's the practices that are upstream, that are harder for us to do, but they're still good for us. And in fact, actually, if we're thinking about growth, we're going to grow the most from the upstream practices. But the practices that are upstream are rarely ones that we enjoy from the very beginning. They're often the ones that we have to work at a little bit. We have to put in the time and the effort. And the reason that we want to do those upstream practices is for each person's like Enneagram type, it butts directly up against your fatal weakness. It directly works on that area where you most need to work. So for example, type 6 is what most people are. Like it's estimated 50% of people are Enneagram 6, and within the traditional mainline church, an even higher percentage. And the deadly weakness, the fatal sin of the 6 is this idea of fear and anxiety and worry. And that's often why you may notice if you ever do sermon series about combating worry and anxiety, they get like a lot of traction. And that's because most of your people are 6s. And it was saying that like an upstream practice, for example, for a 6 is scripture memorization. That like it's things that it's difficult for them to do, not about intellectual ability, but just something about their anxiety. You have to calm your mind in order to memorize well. Like an anxious mind can't memorize. Like if you're panicking about a test and you're going over stuff, it's not going to stick. You know, so like that's one. And the reason that's a good practice, what's that?
I said, I think everyone's had that experience, right?
Yeah. And the reason that's a good practice for the 6 is to memorize verses in particular that speak to ideas of fear and anxiety, so that when you are overcome by these things, you are able to have those verses, those words from God right at your fingertips, right there to then speak to the fear. Another one, interestingly enough, is I think it's a great example of things that nobody really likes, and we don't even practice it anymore even that much, except that Jesus totally thought we should, and that's fasting. Like fasting is a great upstream practice for the 6, because in fasting, there is a psychological fear of starvation, and it's purely psychological. Like when you're hungry, your body will tell you like, I have to have food or I'm going to die. Yes, in a month, that is true. But for today, or for missing this lunch or whatever it is, you're going to be be fine. But we put in that effort of the fasting to be able to learn that God is sufficient. In fact, fasting is the upstream practice of your and my Enneagram type as well, a type 7. The reason that fasting is that for us is 7 is all about excess. And so to be able to fast and to have nothing teaches us how to be content with little, which is a big thing for the type 7. The other thing is for the type 7, for you and me, Kyle, is this idea of solitude and silence. Because
those are hard.
because those downstream practices for us, the ones that are easy, that we enjoy, are fellowship and celebration. Those are great. We love them. They boost our spirits. They come to us so easily. Like it's the most natural thing in the world. And I'll admit, I thought about that as you were talking about your church's activities and the things that you do. And I was like, that's an activity of a 7. Yep, that fellowship meal, activity of a 7. There we go. And these even the time of service you were mentioning, those are communal times of serving. It's like, oh, Kyle's a 7. And so that's
not a surprise, right? When you were describing those characteristics, I know the Alamance folks who are watching are going, yep, that's Kyle.
And that's why solitude and stillness are so big for us. So centering prayer, like a time of centering prayer is prayer where we come before God, but we're not actively thinking anything. We are seeking only to sit in God's presence. And so learning to still the mind is huge. Every type has their and then I guess just there are also then the activities, and this is why I thought my project was so important and had so much applicability to the church. There are also spiritual disciplines that are neither upstream nor downstream, maybe perfectly fine, but I like to call those things swing and a miss. Like, nothing wrong with them. They're not going to really do much for me. So like the type 5 and type 4s rather are an artistic type. So if you gave me the activity, hey, read this scripture passage and draw an image that God has put on your mind. The type 4 is going to think that's amazing. Downstream practice. I'm going to be like, this is stupid. This is dumb. I don't like this. And even if I try my hardest, I'm just not going to grow from that much, no matter how many times I do it, based on who God made me. And so that's what I think was so neat about my doctoral work, was to then find, okay, let's look at who God made you to be. Because I think so much of the time what we do in the church is, and this is going back to trying to make people busy, we're just trying to say, let's just put out stuff. We're treating it buckshot style. I'm just going to shoot something and maybe something will land, instead of like this laser guided pinpointed thing. And so we're just putting all this stuff out there. So we have people who want to grow, who want to be faithful. And if you open those church doors, they are going to be there no matter how tired they are, no matter whether this is really doing much for them. And that's once again, not that it's about them necessarily, but just simply the fact that like, if you're there telling me that, I'm going to do it. So how many people have not had any call to children's ministry, but we've asked to watch in the nursery just because we need somebody, and we do that a lot. So we're keeping people busy instead of helping them to become holy. And that was, like I said, a large part of the project was helping to discern, okay, so this is how God's made you. And I think there's freedom in it as well, to be able to say, you know what, I don't think that God has equipped me or called me to serve in the children's ministry. I know there's a need, but let's just pray to the Lord of the harvest, counting that God will, be able to provide in that way. But instead, I think my gifts would more align with this. And I think we need to be able to empower our people to say that as well, even if it means that we're struggling to find somebody with the nursery as we're waiting in faith for God to provide the person whose heart does long in that way.
That's right. And interestingly enough, and maybe this is a good spot to close, I think that when we empower folks to do that kind of work, where they really explore, what God is calling them to do, and how God has made them, and where that might find them fitting in the life of the congregation or even beyond it. I think that the yield is such that you want to provide for the nursery and you don't have anyone, you empower the whole church to do the work of ministry in the ways that they long for. And oddly enough, that nursery person is going to pop out, right?
Yeah.
They're going to find their way to it because they're watching and living into the reality of a community that's really on fire. And that's part of what you're talking about, is when people are using their gifts, and that's just making the whole thing go. When we're meeting those needs, I think that it inspires and empowers others to take hold of that too. And Evan, thank you so much for spending this time with me. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, buddy.
Always good to talk to you, as we've been doing and will be doing with this series. This is the kind of conversation you and I would have anyway. It's just neat to be able to let the whole church in and let them experience it with us. So thanks for coming on. Do you want a last word before we go?
You know, the only thing I thought about, just as a word, I guess, for like us, is this idea that I think I'm the cook in the family. And you know, one of the things that's so hard is when I make a new recipe and nobody likes it. And it stinks, you know, and it's just like, and I think sometimes like we just have to be willing as the spiritual leaders of the church, that being pastors, elders, whomever, to be able to say like, it's okay to fail sometimes. It's okay to make something and have people not like it, because how else will you know? You know, like how else will you be able to like figure out unless you've done that? And so I think about that as like, as difficult as it is, there are times that not everybody is going to like something. And what we have to also discern is this the kind of thing that's an acquired taste that they'll come to like and maybe even love once they've had it a few times? Or is this the kind of thing we have to just let go of? I think that's an important word for us.
Yeah.
Because, you know, some of my favorite foods are sushi. I think of two things, sushi and kombucha. I really love both of those. And yet the first time I had both, I hated them. And I thought they were terrible. And now it's like nothing delights my palate more than those things. It wasn't bacon that everybody loves immediately. You know, like that's the easy thing. And so I think sometimes as we're figuring out different daily practices and spiritual disciplines and what we as leaders are trying to put out there for the church, that's our discernment moment to say, okay, sometimes we're going to fail, but it's okay. We need to continue in this because God's going to do something with it. And I just know this. And sometimes we have to say, you know what? This teaching people to long for the sea in that way didn't work, but it's okay because we're going to try this other way that gets us to the same spot. So I think that's just like my last little thing that I thought about saying, that it didn't really work in because like Brussels sprouts are great for us as well. Very few people like them the first time.
I am totally with you on the Brussels sprouts, not the kombucha, but maybe I need to try it again. Brussels sprouts are my favorite, particularly when Andrew Long makes them, though Michelle has gotten to make a mean Brussels sprout too. Evan, thank you, my friend. Thank you.
You're welcome, buddy.
For being with us, and we'll catch up again soon. And thanks for sharing. You take care.
Yeah.
All right.
See you later, man. Yep. Bye.